In this video lecture, we're going to be looking at John Locke's second treatise on government. So Locke is a famous English philosopher. Some of his notable, important philosophical works: A Letter Concerning Toleration, the two treatises of government, again, which we're looking at the second one, and an essay concerning human understanding. So we begin with the state of nature. So the state of nature is that place prior to the existence of civil society, prior to the existence of a government, laws that regulate the ways in which human beings interact with one another. So the state of nature, Locke thinks, is actually a place, right prior to there being government, where it's mostly peaceful, where there is natural morality and reason, that every human being is endowed with a sense of good and evil, and endowed with the ability to think rationally. Specifically, he says, the state of nature is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature. So, right, there's complete freedom to, if I want to go and pick an apple, I can pick an apple. If I want to go run around for an hour, I can run around for an hour. If I want to live on the other side of the world, assuming somehow I can get there, right? But I can go wherever I want to go, okay? There's no, borders or anything like that. I'm fully free to do whatever I like, whatever I desire, whatever I will. The state of nature is also, he says, a state of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. So, in the state of nature, right, everyone has equal status with one another, because there is no hierarchy. Of course, there is no society in which there could be some kind of established form of production which leads to the accumulation of wealth by a few, enabling them to dominate over the poor majority. There's no status in terms of political, because there's no government, so there's no rulers, whether elected or just taken by force, office taken by force. I mean, of course there could be inequality in the sense of maybe like physical characteristics, where some people could be stronger than others, but that is more like metaphysically accidental, wherein in this case, right, what he's saying is politically everyone is equal, and metaphysically everyone is equal, because they are all endowed with, again, the basic natural moral sense and the ability to use reason. Now, in the state of nature, there is the law of nature, which in a sense governs it. So he says that the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So, the law of nature is reason, because again, everyone is endowed with reason. So everyone can think rationally, what is in my best interest? And everyone can think, well, using our moral sense, maybe I shouldn't go and steal from someone else. Maybe I shouldn't rape someone else, or whatever, as of course happens in especially, right, older societies with less strict moral customs, or less strict, penal enforcement, right? So all kinds of things like that. Maybe I, shouldn't even eat that fruit that I know is poisonous, right? I can use reason to think, I know that this thing over here is poisonous, so I shouldn't go and eat it, right? Or maybe I should go and trade with this person over here because they have milk and I really need milk, so maybe I can give them something else, right? So there's ways in which the use of reason kind of governs the ways in which we interact with one another according to our own self-interest. Now, out of this then, as Locke argues, comes this idea of life, liberty, right, and possessions, to not harm someone in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. So what we get are the three natural rights. The first natural right, life. Now, there's this interesting question, right? So I have a right to life, which means I have a right to destroy that which threatens my own destruction. Now, we just saw that the law of nature says I shouldn't harm someone else, yet this right to life that the law of nature explains to me that I have, this right to life, says that I can actually, it is acceptable to destroy that which threatens my own destruction, which means if someone else comes to try and kill me, I have the right to try and stop them, even if that means I might have to kill them. So why? Two reasons. First, Locke says, the principle of punishment. He says, and thus it is that every man in the state of nature has a power to kill a murderer, both to deter others from doing the like injury, which no reparation can compensate, by the example of the punishment that attends it from every body. So, in this case, I can actually defend my life, I can preserve my life through a kind of deterrence, where I say, look, this is what happens if you come and mess with me. You don't want to end up like this person over there that I had to fight off. The other reason is the principle of legitimate power. He says, the execution of the law of nature is, in that state, put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. So because there is no government, there's no state that is able, where you can go to court and determine whether someone was right or wrong and they can be punished or not. In the state of nature, because that doesn't exist, it's up to every single individual to interpret and enforce this law of nature. That means every single person has the right then to take action when certain rights, like the right to life, are threatened. And there's a kind of psychological way in which this kind of sense of self-preservation is built into this conception of reason that Locke has, right? What is in my self-interest? Well, it's not in my self-interest to go around and just kill other people, because then that's going to make people very upset, where they're going to turn on me and probably kill me. But it is in my self-interest to, again, right, the principle of punishment, perhaps physically hurt others, to deter other people from potentially hurting or killing me. So there's a psychological component to this as well. Now, the second natural right is liberty. So Locke explains this in two ways. So first, he says, the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. Second, this freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it, but by what forfeits his preservation and life together. So we can see then that the three natural rights are actually reinforcing of one another. That I have the right to liberty because I need to be free to do what is necessary to preserve my own life. And likewise, I have the right to life, which ensures that I need this right to liberty, because otherwise it's difficult to act according to self-preservation if I'm not free to do what is required to preserve my own life. And again, I need this liberty because since there is no government, it is up to me to interpret that natural law and to enforce it. So I have to have the freedom to act according to the natural law. I need to have the freedom to go and live in a more fertile place according to, to protect my life. I need to have the freedom to go and create a shelter, to drink water, so all these different ways in which I need to reinforce my right to life, and act on self-preservation. Now, the final natural right is property, and this is perhaps the most famous and really the most consequential of the natural rights that Locke puts forth. So he says everyone has a right to private property, to possessions that are owned and can only be done with by that single individual and no one else, where no one else has a right, to mess with it. Now, you might think, well, that seems very strange, because Locke talks about how God gave the earth to all, and how God gave the earth to all to be held in common. If that's the case, then why have humans come to privately possess property, right? Why can they say, this is my apple, you can't eat it. This is my house, you can't sleep in it. This is my land, you can't work on it to grow food for yourself. Well, he gives an argument here, and I've laid it out in terms of the main premises here. So the first premise put forward by Locke is, he says, the earth is given to humans for the support and comfort of their being. So again, the earth is given to humans in order to preserve the right to life, in order to make possible human beings to act on that right to life. Right? We need the sustenance from food. We need, to be able to cut down trees for shelter, or live in caves or whatever for shelter, so on and so forth. Right? So the earth is there for the benefit of humans. Now, the second premise: there must be a means to appropriate goods before they can be used. Right? So there has to be a way in which I can do something with the tree to turn it into shelter. Right? Now, there are two sub-premises that justify this claim. First, every person has a property in their own self. So I have a property in my own self as a human being, which is why I have a right to life, right? Why someone else can't come and just say, I don't like you with that arm on you, I'm going to cut, that arm off. But they can't do that, because I own my own self. All right, myself is a property to myself that I privately own. Now, an extension of the self, then, if I own myself, then I own the action with which I use my own body that I own, which means the labor that I use is my own. That when I till the ground, that is my labor, right? I own that labor. No one else owns that labor. Now, of course, right? This idea of where we can sell our labor and work for a wage, but it means we sell our labor. We have the right to sell our labor. No one can just enslave us and coerce us to use our labor for their own benefit. Now, the third premise, the most crucial premise perhaps in this step: external things labored upon, whereby the value is increased, makes it one's property. Now, because my own labor, or because the labor I perform is labor that I own, then when I labor on something and I increase its value, I have put part of myself through the use of that labor which I own. I've effectively put that labor into that object. So if I have a piece of clay and I mold it, let's say, into a mug like this, I have increased the value of that clay, because now it can be used to hold liquids where we can drink, for example, coffee out of it. Now, this means I have put part of myself into this mug through the transfer of my labor into the mug, or into the clay that is now a mug, right? And because I own my own body, because I own my own labor, and I transfer that labor into this mug, I therefore have a right to own this mug, because it now has a part of myself in it. So anything that mixes one's labor, or therefore one's property, with something else makes it then the property of one's self. Therefore, there is a natural right to property. And ultimately, again, since these rights are kind of mutually self-reinforcing, this right to property serves ultimately, of course, the right to life, the right to acquire property, whether this be in a mug to hold water to drink so I can survive, the ability to have a house so that I can survive, and so on and so forth, right? They all serve the other rights, and the other rights serve the right to property, which is why we saw, again, in the sub-premise 2a, it was because of the right to life, right, that made possible this right to property, that then reinforces my ability to preserve my right to life. Now, I want to look at three further considerations regarding private property. So first, something to keep in mind here that Locke says is that for this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. So what does that mean? I, in using my labor, can have a right to whatever it is I work upon, as long as I have still left enough for others to do the same. Why? Because let's say if I use my labor to go in and fence up all the freshwater sources around the world, and I say, I've now used my labor to, in some way with my fence, I have increased the value of this water because now you have to pay me to walk through the fence, which means, of course, it's more valuable, and some people might pay more or less for it. I now have a right to this water because I put up that fence around all the freshwater water sources. Well, we know water is required for one to continue living. That means other people's right to life has then been put in jeopardy by my privatization of all the water in the world. So Locke does not think then that everything can become private property. Only that which is left enough for others to do the same. And when that encroaches then on the ability of others to do the same, one no longer has a right to that property, even if they mixed their labor with it, because then it starts to jeopardize other people's natural rights. Secondly, Locke says that appropriating land to oneself increases the common stock of humanity. How is that? That seems weird to say that, well, the earth has been given for everyone in common, and yet, if I close off a piece of land, I actually increase the common stock of humanity. And what he says is, well, if that were just left there in the wilderness, its value would not be increased. But if one encloses it off and labors on it, they increase its value, where they plant crops and they're able to grow food, which overall benefits humanity. So this is that basic argument about private property that says when someone owns it, it's taken better care of, and its value increases and it benefits everyone overall. Again, right, that should be read in conjunction, though, with that first statement that Locke is saying it is not right for one to have a monopoly on all things, basically, we could say. Finally, things are made valuable by labor. They are not valuable in themselves. So that is something very interesting to think about. Nothing is valuable in itself. It's only valuable by the labor that is put into it. And this is one of those key components of the labor theory of value that later on Karl Marx comes and says, well, if that's the case, then that means, workers are actually being exploited, where the majority of the value they're producing are stolen from them, right? Marx turns this on Locke and says, look, if you say someone has a right to private property and then they can hire the labor of others to work that private property, well, if other laborers are putting value into it by laboring it, yet they're only receiving part of the revenue that thing is sold for, then they are being denied the full value of their labor, and they therefore, according to Locke's argument for the right to private property, have a right to the rest of that value they created. But that's a separate issue that goes beyond Locke. But this is where we find the beginning there of the labor theory of value. Now, if all this can occur in the state of nature, where we have the right to life, right to liberty, right to property, and we're all endowed with this natural law, why then? Why, if the state of nature is mostly peaceful, where we are naturally moral, why did humans ever leave the state of nature to live under government? Locke responds in two ways. First, he says, I doubt not, but it will be objected, that it is unreasonable for men to be judges in their own cases, that self-love will make men partial to themselves and their friends, and hence nothing but confusion and disorder will follow. So let's take the case of, let's say, some item that someone owns went missing and they think someone stole it. Well, what's going to happen? How are they going to adjudicate this matter? Well, the friends of the person who had the item stolen are going to all side with who that person thinks stole the item. And then the friends of the person that's being accused of stealing the item, their friends are all going to side with them. And there's no rational, impartial way to adjudicate this conflict, right? So in this sense, self-interest is going to go against one another, and it's going to cause problems. Additionally, Locke says, therefore, to supply those defects and imperfections which are in us, because humans, of course, are not perfect, as living singly and solely by ourselves, we are naturally induced to seek communion and fellowship with others. This was the cause of men's uniting themselves at first in political societies. But I moreover affirm that all men are naturally in that state, and they remain so, in the state of nature, until by their own consents they make themselves members of some politic society. In the state of nature, although we are all endowed with a natural sense of morality, and although most of us do act morally most of the time, there are still those occasions when sometimes people don't act morally. What is the best way to adjudicate that situation? Well, Locke thinks we can use reason, and reason will tell us we must leave the state of nature. Because even though it's mostly peaceful and it's pretty good, there's something we're missing. Locke argues that the purpose of government, or the purpose of the state, why it exists, is to protect natural rights, right? The right to life, liberty, and property. It is done this through, first, the established and consistent rational law. So some kind of law, right? Perhaps a constitution that is set down where no one can just arbitrarily determine, what are the regulations people in that society have to follow by or not. It's known to everyone and it's consistent. 2, there has to be then an impartial and sovereign judge to interpret what that law is, what has been established by members of that community. And then you need some kind of definitive authority to enforce it. So unlike in the state of nature, where if there's a conflict that arises, people are going to side with their friends and family against one another, and let's say they end up, getting in a fight, and Group B wins the fight against Group A, right? And Group A submits, and they say, okay, whatever. Well, what's to stop, next week, Group A from saying, you know what, we want revenge. We're going to get back at Group B, and going and attacking Group B, right? You can't settle these kinds of disputes. There's no finality in the state of nature. Only if there is a state that has a monopoly on the use of force can there be this kind of finality. Can there be a definitive authority to enforce the interpretation and ruling of the law? You need a sovereign, that entity where there is no recourse above them. Where you have a dispute, the sovereign decides, and that's final. As Locke says, whenever therefore any number of men are so united into one society as to quit every one of his executive power of the law of nature and to resign it to the public, there and there only is a political or civil society. So it is in our best interest, actually. Reason tells us to leave the state of nature because it says your private property, your liberty, although you give up some of your liberty, of course, because you allow someone else to interpret and enforce law. But you enable a more guaranteed protection of life, liberty, and ultimately property. Now, what Locke advances is known as the social contract theory. So, entrance into a political society, right, in leaving the state of nature to establish a government, is done is legitimately done only by voluntary consent, that this cannot be done by force. So unlike someone like Hobbes, who says all that matters is whether a sovereign has been established or not, Locke says, no, you can't have a conqueror that establishes himself as the sovereign. That's illegitimate, because that violates, of course, everyone's natural right to liberty. The only way this can be done is by voluntary consent, where one says, look, I have this natural right to liberty, and I'm going to use that liberty to consent to the will of the state. As Locke says, men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against any that are not of it. Now one might object, hold on, I don't remember signing some kind of contract that says I consent to the authority of, for example, the United States of America government. So it would seem like the U.S. government is illegitimate, for example. But Locke says, no, actually, it's not the case that everyone actually has to sign, some kind of piece of paper that says, I, hereby consent to the authority of the government I happen to live under, right? What he says is that if given the chance, we would all rationally agree to enter government if it actually protects our natural rights. That we would use reason, right, to think hypothetically, okay, would my right to life, my right to liberty, my right to property, would that be better protected in the state of nature or under government? And Locke says clearly, using reason, we say, it would be better protected under government. So no formal agreement is necessary, merely a rational, hypothetical, implicit agreement. Now, this does not mean, of course, that any government is better than no government, as someone like Hobbes argued. For Locke, when power exceeds authority, or when authority is exercised without power, the parties to the contract have the right to dissolve it and to form a new agreement. That whenever, then, a government abuses the power it has been endowed with by its citizens, whenever it no longer protects the right to life, liberty, and property, and whenever, using reason, we could see, actually, living in the state of nature, living without a government, our right to life, liberty, and property would be better than under this current government. We have the right to dissolve that government and form a new government. Locke says, whensoever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands, for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. Now, what Locke has done in the second treatise is provide a framework for liberal democracy. And we can see this in three ways. First, based on his accounts of the social contract, government is only legitimate if it is given consent. That our consent, the consent of those who are ruled over, is necessary. Otherwise, a government is not democratic. It is not legitimate because it has not been entrusted with by the will of the people. Secondly, a legitimate government then functions according to the will of the majority. As he says, it is necessary the body should move that way whither the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority, or else it is impossible it should act or continue one body, one community, which the consent of every individual that united into it agreed that it should. And so everyone is bound by that consent to be concluded by the majority. Because of, if the only way a government is legitimate is if everyone consents to it, and everyone doesn't actually literally have to consent to it, only rationally, then what that means is all that's required for a government to pass laws is what the majority of people would agree to. Because everyone has already then consented to the ruling of that government. The question is, how is it going to function? Well, then that requires then the will of the people, because they are the ones that give it the consent. And will is determined by majority. In the same way he thinks, how human beings act according to our desires, when kind of one desire over another is more influential. Finally, he says, a legitimate commonwealth can be a monarchy, oligarchy, or democracy, but the ultimate sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. Now, this might seem a little strange. How can he just say that a government is only legitimate if it's given consent, and that if it functions according to the will of the majority, yet a legitimate commonwealth can be a monarchy or an oligarchy? Well, what he means is that by monarchy, he means a single ruler. That if everyone consents that they want one person to be in charge, that's legitimate, as long as everyone consents. By oligarchy, he just means a small number of people. If everyone consents to have a small, perhaps council, rule over them, then that is legitimate, as long as everyone consents. So the last thing that I wanted to do was actually compare Thomas Hobbes and John Locke to see the ways in which their political philosophies differ. I think this helps illuminate John Locke more. So for Hobbes, humanity in the state of nature is selfish and immoral, whereas for Locke, humanity is rational and good. The purpose of the state for Thomas Hobbes is to end chaos in order to create perpetual peace and security. For Locke, it's merely natural rights. Right? So for Hobbes, the purpose of government is to ensure security, stability of society. Locke says, no, it's actually to protect natural rights. It's not about security. It's only security in regards to the natural rights, nothing more. Type of government. Hobbes says only an absolute monarchy is legitimate, because only then can the will of the sovereign be unified. Locke says no, the only legitimate type of government is one by constitutional rule, right? Where there's this established rule of law that everyone abides by. Now, how do you enter into this government? Hobbes says, by an all-powerful coercive sovereign, where there is no divine right for a ruler. So a ruler can't just say that, well, God has said that God has chosen me to rule. No, you just need someone who's all-powerful that everyone will submit to, whether they agree to submit to it, or whether, because they're all-powerful, they force everyone into submission. Of course, Locke says, yes, there's no such thing as the divine right to rule, but there must be voluntary agreement. You cannot have a coercive sovereign. Finally, on the idea of natural rights, Hobbes says there is a right of self-preservation and there is a right of liberty, but both are ultimately given up to the state, which is why you have an absolute monarchy, because security is more favorable than the right to liberty. Now, ultimately, your right to life is preserved by the state, but the sovereign, of course, has the ultimate say over if someone needs to be killed or not. And in that way, technically, your right to life is actually given up to the state, according to Hobbes. And finally, with Locke, again, his natural rights, he says, are life, liberty, and property. Now, these are somewhat sacrificed to the state, but it's ultimately for the overall greater protection of these rights. So I hope that helps illuminate more John Locke's political philosophy.